Hidden Crime Stories: The Jeffrey Dahmer Story. At about 11:30 on the night of July 22, 1991, Milwaukee Police Department patrol units saw a partially clothed man stumbling down the road near an apartment building on North 25th Street. A handcuff could be seen dangling from his wrist. His name was Tracy Edwards. He was 32 years old and he was shaking, not from the July heat, but from something else entirely. Something he had just walked out of. Something he was trying to put as much distance between himself and as fast as his legs would carry him. The officers pulled over. They got out. They approached him carefully, the way you approach someone who looks like they have been through something that has no clean explanation. Tracy Edwards told them about the apartment. He told them about the man inside, about the knife, about the handcuff that had been on both his wrists before he managed to get one hand free, about the photographs he had seen on the bedroom wall. Photographs that he could not fully describe because his mind was still trying to process what his eyes had seen. The officers walked him back to the building on North 25th Street, up to the second floor, apartment 213. After finding the knife and Dahmer's photographs of dismembered bodies plus a severed head in the refrigerator, Dahmer was arrested. One of the arresting officers later said that when he opened that refrigerator and saw what was inside, when the full reality of what was in that apartment began to reveal itself, he felt the floor shift beneath him. Not metaphorically. He said his legs actually stopped working for a moment, that his body had a physical response to what his eyes were sending to his brain before his conscious mind had fully formed the thought. The forensics team investigating Dahmer's apartment discovered 4 human heads, several internal organs including 2 hearts, chemicals such as chloroform and formaldehyde, seversums and male genitalia, a box containing 2 skulls, dozens of photos of victims' bodies, numerous saws and drills, a complete skeleton and a 57-gallon drum containing acid with 3 decomposing human torsos. 17 people had been killed in that apartment. 17 men and boys, lured, drugged, murdered, and dismembered in a 1-bedroom apartment in a building where people went about their lives every single day, where neighbors cooked dinner and watched television and complained about the parking and did all the ordinary things that ordinary people do in ordinary apartment buildings. While Jeffrey Dahmer did what he did behind a locked door 30 feet away, the man in apartment 213 was quiet, well-mannered, soft-spoken. His co-workers at the chocolate factory where he worked described him as pleasant and unremarkable. His neighbors knew him as the blond man on the second floor who kept to himself and sometimes had a funny smell coming from his unit. They had been told it was spoiled meat. On Hidden Crime Stories, we are going to walk every step of this story. Not just what Jeffrey Dahmer did, but what the world around him did and did not do that allowed it to continue for 13 years. Because this story is not only about one man's crimes. It is about a system that looked directly at the evidence and chose not to see it. About who gets believed and who doesn't. About what happens when the people whose job it is to protect us decide that some lives matter less than others. That is the most important story this case has to tell, and it is one we have not finished reckoning with. Stay with me. Bath Township, Ohio, May 21, 1960. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born the first of 2 children to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. His early childhood was unremarkable in the ways that count. A house in the suburbs, a father who worked as a chemist, a mother whose struggles with mental health cast an unpredictable shadow over the household. He was a shy child, withdrawn. He had difficulty connecting with other children and found the social rituals of school confusing and exhausting. What people who knew him in those years remember most consistently is a quality of absence. Not menace, nothing that felt dangerous or alarming. Just a blankness. A quality of being present in a room without quite being there. He was fascinated, from a young age, with the insides of things, with what animals looked like beneath their skin. He collected roadkill. He preserved specimens. His father Lionel, a chemist, saw this as a sign of scientific curiosity and engaged with it, teaching his son how to bleach and preserve animal bones. It was a well-intentioned response to what looked, from the outside, like an unusual but ultimately harmless interest. He graduated from high school in 1978. His parents' marriage was collapsing around him. His mother took his younger brother and left. His father was temporarily living elsewhere, and Jeffrey Dahmer was alone in the family home in Bath Township, Ohio, 18 years old, isolated, and for the first time in his life entirely without supervision. Dahmer told police he had picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks taken him home for a beer, and when Hicks wanted to leave, Dahmer smashed the back of his head with a barbell and then strangled him. He was 18 years old. It was June 1978. He buried the body in the backyard. Then he dug it up, dissolved the flesh with acid, and pulverized the bones. Then he scattered what remained in the woods behind the house. Then he went on with his life. He enrolled in college briefly, dropped out, enlisted in the Army, was discharged for alcohol problems, drifted to Florida, then back to the Midwest, then to his grandmother's house in West Allis, Wisconsin, where she took him in and gave him the stability he seemed to need. He got a job at the Ambrosia Chocolate Factory in Milwaukee. He was punctual, competent, and completely unremarkable as an employee. He attended church with his grandmother on Sundays. He was to the people around him a young man who had struggled but was finding his footing. He killed his second victim 9 years after his first, and then the pace began to accelerate. Between 1987 and 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer killed 15 more people. Let's say the names: Jamie Doxtator, Richard Guerrero, Anthony Sears, Eddie Smith, Ricky Beeks, Ernest Miller, David Thomas, Curtis Straughter, Errol Lindsay, Tony Hughes, Conorak Synthasophone, Matt Turner, Jeremiah Weinberger, Oliver Lacey, Joseph Bradaholt. These were real people, young men, most of them black, many of them gay or bisexual, many of them from communities that had already been systematically underserved and overlooked by the institutions around them. Some were aspiring models, some Sumer students, some were working men trying to build something. One of them, Errol Lindsay, never got to meet his daughter, who was born 6 months after his murder. They were not abstractions. They were not props. They were people with futures that were taken from them, and the specific demographics of who Jeffrey Dahmer chose to target is not incidental to this story. It is central to it, and we will come back to it. His methodology was consistent and practiced. He frequented gay bars and bathhouses in Milwaukee, approaching men with the easy confidence of someone who has never struggled to hold a conversation. He was charming in the way that quiet, attentive people can be charming. He listened, he seemed interested. He offered drinks and the promise of money for photographs back at his apartment. Once they were inside apartment 13, he drugged them. He used sleeping pills dissolved in drinks, a method he refined over time as he learned what worked most reliably. When his victims were unconscious, he killed them. He kept photographs. He kept body parts. He was trying, in the most literal and grotesque sense imaginable, to ensure that the people he brought to his apartment could never leave him. It speaks to something in Dahmer's psychology that investigators and forensic psychiatrists have spent decades analyzing: a desperate, consuming loneliness and a terror of abandonment so extreme that expressed itself as the need to make departure permanently impossible. He was not trying to cause pain for its own sake. He was trying to prevent loss. That psychological context does not excuse anything. It does not reduce what he did to his victims by a single fraction. But it matters for understanding how he operated, how he presented himself as warm and attentive and genuinely interested in the people he targeted, because in some profoundly damaged way he was. His grandmother had become annoyed with his bringing men to his house late at night and with the foul smells emanating from the basement, so she eventually told to move out. He moved into an apartment at 9 North 24th 5th Street in Milwaukee, and the killing accelerated further. May 27, 1991. This is the date that sits at the center of the Jeffrey Dahmer case, like a wound that never fully healed. This is the date that everything could have stopped. In May 1991, a victim of Dahmer escaped and drew the attention of Milwaukee police officers. The victim, 14-year-old Conorak Synthasophone, was found by 3 women sitting naked and bleeding in public. 3 women found a 14-year-old boy on the street outside Dahmer's apartment building, naked, bleeding, visibly disoriented from the drugs Dahmer had given him. They called 911 immediately. 2 police officers responded. Dahmer arrived at the scene and told the officers that Conorak was his 19-year-old boyfriend, that they had had a disagreement, that the young man had been drinking, that this was a private matter between 2 adults. The police officers who accompanied Synthasophone back to Dahmer's squalid apartment dismissed the event as a domestic dispute. The 3 women who had found Conorak, who had called 911, who were standing there on that street watching this unfold, told the officers that something was wrong, that the boy was too young, that he did not seem like an adult, that something about the situation was deeply, visibly off. the officers dismissed their concerns. They walked Konarak's synthesome phone back to apartment 213. They handed him to Jeffrey Dahmer. They left. One officer called in to dispatch after leaving the apartment. On the recording, a recording that Milwaukee would later have to reckon with publicly and painfully, the officer describes the situation as a domestic dispute and says, in a tone that communicates both dismissiveness and discomfort, that the two were intoxicated homosexuals. Inside apartment 213, at the time those officers stood in the hallway, was the decomposing body of Dahmer's 12th victim. Konarak's synthesome phone was 14 years old. He was killed that night. And here is the thing about the spokesman that the families of Dahmer's subsequent victims have never been able to move past, and never should have to. After Konarak, Dahmer killed 4 more people: Matt Turner, Jeremiah Weinberger, Oliver Lacey, Joseph Bradaholt. 4 more people died because 2 police officers decided that a naked, bleeding, disoriented 14-year-old boy being claimed by a strange man outside a Milwaukee apartment building was not worth a second look. The 3 women who had called the police, who had tried to intervene, who had done exactly what you are supposed to do when you see someone in danger, were ignored. Their instincts were correct. Their concern was legitimate. Their voices were not heard. Why? That question has a complicated, painful, and necessary answer. And it is the answer that makes the Jeffrey Dahmer case matter beyond the crimes themselves. Before we go any further, I need to stop for just one moment and ask you something. If this story is hitting you the way I believe it is right now, if you felt what I felt telling you about that night in May 1991, take 5 seconds and subscribe to Hidden Crime Stories. Every single week we bring you cases exactly like this one, real, deeply researched, told the way the victims and their families deserve. Stories that don't just shock you, stories that make you think, stories that stay with you and change how you see the world around you. We have something extraordinary coming in the weeks ahead that your true crime feed absolutely cannot miss. Subscribe right now and let's get back to Milwaukee, because what the investigation revealed about that city and that system is something every single person watching needs to hear. July 22nd, 1991. Milwaukee. After Tracy Edwards flagged down those patrol officers and led them back to apartment 213, the investigation that followed moved with the speed that only comes when the evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. Dahmer was cooperative from the moment of his arrest. He did not deny. He did not deflect. He sat down with investigators and began talking, and what he told them over the hours and days that followed was a full, detailed, methodical account of everything he had done in that apartment and in the years before it. He confessed to committing 17 teen murders. He said the first had occurred when he was 18, and he had slaughtered 16 more men and boys between 1987 and 1991. He told investigators where victims' remains were. He explained what he had done with them. He described his methods with the clinical detachment of someone who had spent years compartmentalizing what he did at night, from the person he presented to the world during the day. At one point during his arrest, sitting in the back of a police vehicle, he turned to one of the officers and said something that has become one of the most quoted lines in the history of American true crime. "For what I did, I should be dead." It was the most honest thing Jeffrey Dahmer ever said. The Milwaukee Police Department's handling of the case, and specifically the Konarak synthesome phone incident, became the subject of immediate and sustained public outrage. The recording of the officer's dispatch call was released. The 3 women who had tried to intervene gave interviews. The full picture of what had happened on that street in May 1991 became public. The 2 officers who had returned Konarak to Dahmer were fired. They appealed. An arbitrator reinstated them with back pay. The families of the 4 men killed after Konarak filed a lawsuit against the city of Milwaukee. The lawsuit argued that the officers' actions, and specifically the role that bias against gay black men had played in their decision not to investigate further, had directly contributed to 4 additional deaths. The lawsuit was ultimately dismissed. The community that had lost the most to Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes, the black community of Milwaukee's North Side, the gay community that had watched their members disappear without adequate police response, held vigils and organized, and demanded answers with the grief and the fury of people who had always known that their safety was not treated as a priority. The investigation into Dahmer's crimes was thorough and complete. The investigation into the systems that had allowed those crimes to continue, that was a different story. Some questions about that system have still not been fully answered. January 13, 1992, Milwaukee County Circuit Court. Instead of determining guilt or innocence, this killer would be judged on whether he had been driven by insanity or had committed incomprehensible acts as a sane man. Dahmer had already confessed. The physical evidence was beyond dispute. The trial was not about what he had done. It was about the state of his mind when he did it. The defense argued that a man who had done what Jeffrey Dahmer had done, who had kept the things he kept, done the things he did after death, eaten what he ate, could not be considered legally sane. That the acts themselves were evidence of a mind that had lost all connection with consensual reality. The prosecution argued that Dahmer's careful planning, the methodical selection of victims, the deliberate use of drugs, the systematic disposal of evidence, the years of sustained behavior that required planning and secrecy, and the management of a double life, was the behavior of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and had chosen to do it. A man who is truly psychotic does not hold down a factory job for years. A man who has lost touch with reality does not carefully plan how to avoid leaving forensic evidence. A man driven purely by uncontrollable compulsion does not also manage to be punctual, cooperative, and unremarkable to every supervisor he ever had. The jury agreed with the prosecution, convicted on the 17th of February 1992, 15 counts of first-degree intentional homicide in Wisconsin, additional charges in Ohio for his first victim, 16 consecutive life sentences plus 10 years. In the courtroom, the families of his victims sat and listened. Some of them spoke. They described their sons, their brothers, their fathers, the specific and irreplaceable people who had been reduced to evidence in a criminal proceeding. They described what the years of not knowing had done to them, what the moment of confirmation had done to them, what they were going to carry for the rest of their lives. Some of them directed their words not just at Dahmer but at the city of Milwaukee, at the police department, at the system that had stood at the threshold of apartment 213 in May 1991 and walked away. They were not wrong to do so. Dahmer was reported to have adjusted well to prison life, although he was kept apart from the general population initially. He gave interviews. He spoke with investigators about his psychology. He expressed what appeared to some observers as genuine remorse, though forensic psychologists who interviewed him extensively were cautious about how much weight to give that appearance. On November 28, 1994, Jeffrey Dahmer died. He was beaten to death by a fellow inmate at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, killed while on a work detail in the prison gymnasium. He was 34 years old. He had served 2 years of 16 life sentences. The families of his victims received the news in different ways. Some felt something, some felt nothing. Some said the only honest thing, that no ending to this story was going to feel like enough, that there was no conclusion that gave back what had been taken. They were right. There never is. Before I give you my final thoughts on this case, I need to speak to you directly for just a moment. If you have watched this far, you already know that this episode is different from anything we have done before on this channel. If it moved you, if it made you think, if it made you feel something you are still trying to name, please leave a comment below right now. Tell me what hit you hardest. Tell me what question this story left you with. Tell me what case you want us to tell next. Your comments shape this channel and tell YouTube that these stories deserve to be seen by more people. And if someone in your life needs to hear what happened in Milwaukee in 1991, please share this video with them tonight. One share can change who finds us. Now here is what I need you to carry from all of this. I want to go back to May 27, 1991, to those 3 women on that street. The women who found Conric Synthesomephone, 14 years old, naked, bleeding, disoriented, and immediately understood that something was deeply, urgently wrong. Who called 911? Who stood there when the officers arrived and said clearly and directly, "Something is wrong with this boy. He is too young. This does not look right." They were ignored. And I want to ask the question that their experience forces us to ask. The question that makes this case about something much larger than one man's crimes. Why? Why did 2 police officers look at a naked, bleeding 14-year-old being claimed by a stranger and decide that the 3 women who called 911 were wrong and the stranger was right? Why did the smell in that apartment, described by the officers themselves as extremely foul, not prompt a search? Why did the distress that was visible on Conric's face not register as the emergency that it was? The honest answer The answer that Milwaukee's Black and LGBTQ communities had already known long before the Dahmer case made its national news is that the value assigned to a life in a crisis situation is not always equal, that who gets believed, who gets protected, who gets the benefit of the doubt, and whose distress registers as an emergency worth investigating. These things are not determined purely by the facts of the situation in front of the officers. They are shaped by bias, by assumption, by the accumulated weight of which communities have historically been treated as worthy of protection and which have not. Konarak Sinthasamphone was a young Asian boy in a predominantly black neighborhood in a city where gay men of color had been disappearing for years, without generating the kind of urgent investigative response that their disappearances deserved. The officers who handed him back to Jeffrey Dahmer may not have made a conscious decision to value his life less, but the outcome of their decision spoke clearly about the world they were operating in. This is not comfortable to say. It is not comfortable to hear, and it is completely devastatingly true. The families of Matt Turner, Jeremiah Weinberger, Oliver Lacey, and Joseph Bradaholt, the 4 men killed after Konarak, have lived with this truth for 30 years. They did not lose their sons and brothers and fathers only to Jeffrey Dahmer. They lost them to a system that had multiple opportunities to intervene and chose not to. That is the second crime at the center of this story. And unlike the crimes committed inside Apartment 213, this one does not have a single person to hold responsible. It has a structure, a culture, a set of assumptions so deeply embedded in how policing was practiced in Milwaukee in 1991 that 2 officers could hand a bleeding child back to a killer and call in a routine domestic dispute without feeling that they had done anything wrong. Structures can be changed. Cultures can be changed. Assumptions can be examined and challenged and replaced with something better, but only if we are willing to name them honestly. Here is what I want you to take from this story. When the people around you, neighbors, coworkers, ordinary members of your community, raise an alarm about something they have seen, take it seriously. The 3 women who called 911 on May 27, 1991 were right. They saw what they saw. They reported it clearly and directly. They were overruled by people with authority who were wrong. Your instinct when something is wrong is not automatically less credible than an official's assumption that it isn't. Your observation is not automatically less valid than an authority figure's dismissal of it. The lesson of that night is not that 3 women failed to save Konarak Sinthasamphone. They tried. They did everything right. The lesson is about what happens when the systems we trust to protect the most vulnerable among us operate on the assumption that some lives require less urgency than others. We have to keep asking whether that is still true. In our own communities, in the institutions we interact with, in the way we respond when the people being ignored or dismissed or disbelieved are people who don't look like the people power has traditionally been designed to protect. Konarak Sinthasamphone was 14 years old. His name deserves to be the name we remember most from this story. Not Dahmer's, his, and so do the names of every man who came after him. Stephen, Jamie, Richard, Anthony, Eddie, Ricky, Ernest, David, Curtis, Errol, Tony, Konarak, Matt, Jeremiah, Oliver, Joseph, 17 people. 7 complete, specific, irreplaceable lives. We say their names because they are worth more than the story of the man who took them. They always were.